I want to start today by looking directly at a number that, honestly, it really highlights a massive failure of modern medicine. Right now, in the U.S. alone, there are over 100,000 people just sitting on the waiting list for an organ transplant.
Yeah, and about 17 of those people die
Yeah.
every single day waiting. It's a staggering reality.
Right.
And the most frustrating part of that statistic is that the supply of donor organs realistically will just never come close to meeting the demand.
Because the whole system relies on human tragedy, right?
Exactly. Someone has to die for someone else to live. And on top of that, the patient has to win this crazy biological lottery to find a perfect match.
Just so their immune system doesn't reject the foreign tissue.
Yep.
It's a bottleneck that just constantly costs lives. But that raises a massive question, which is, what if we don't have to wait for a donor at all?
Right. What if we could just manufacture our way out of this shortage?
Which brings us to our mission today. Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a stack of industry white papers, biotech financial reports, and lab studies tracking the absolute bleeding edge of bioprinting.
Yeah, we are going to unpack the engineering behind how machines are literally learning to 3D print living, breathing human tissue.
We'll explore the physical mechanisms, the microscopic plumbing problem keeping printed kidneys out of your local hospital, and basically separate the science fiction from the medical reality to give you an actual timeline.
The core mission here is to understand that shift. You know, moving from relying on pure chance to relying on engineering. It's a radical bet by the biomedical industry.
They're betting we can build complex biology from the ground up, which is wild. But to understand how we engineer something that intricate today, we actually have to look back at the origin of this field.
Oh yeah, the early 2000s.
Yeah, it didn't start in some billion-dollar futuristic laboratory with, like, custom-built robotics. It started at Clemson University with a researcher named Thomas Boland. And he basically ran a Frankenstein experiment using standard office supplies.
He literally took an ordinary desktop inkjet printer. I mean, the exact same beige plastic box sitting on millions of desks back then.
Ones that always jammed.
Right. He took the ink cartridges out, emptied them, and filled them with a solution of living cells.
Just cells in a liquid.
Yeah. Then he sent a document to the printer and just hit print.
And the craziest part is the cells actually survived the trip. Like, they came shooting out of the nozzle alive, landed exactly where the printer's software dictated on the page, and just continued to function.
It's incredible when you think about it. If a machine can place a microscopic dot of black ink at an exact coordinate to form a letter, it can place a dot of living cells at an exact coordinate in three-dimensional space.
Right. And by repeating that process, building it up layer after layer, you are no longer printing a flat picture.
No, you're manufacturing a physical structure made of living tissue.
Okay, but modern bioprinters have evolved a lot from that hacked office hardware, right?
Oh, massively. But they still rely on that fundamental bottom-up construction. Today, the process requires a specific toolkit, starting with the material itself, which we call bioink.
Bioink.
Yeah, it consists of living cells, frequently the patient's own cells harvested from a biopsy.
Which completely neutralizes the risk of organ rejection, right? Because it's your own DNA.
Exactly. And those cells are suspended inside a specialized hydrogel.
Wait, I have a question about that. Structurally, if you're forcing living human cells through a micro-extrusion nozzle, how do you prevent shear stress from just shredding the cell membranes?
That is a great question.
Like, hanging cells in a hydrogel sounds fine for a flat sheet, but pushing them through a pressurized tube, that seems like it would just destroy them.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most complex engineering hurdles in bioink formulation. The hydrogel isn't just a regular liquid. It has to be a non-Newtonian fluid.
Oh, like cornstarch and water.
Sort of, but in reverse. It needs to exhibit what we call shear thinning behavior. So when pressure is applied inside the nozzle, the gel thins out.
Okay, making it easier to flow.
Exactly. It flows smoothly and encases the cells in this protective fluid cushion that absorbs all that mechanical stress.
Oh, wow.
And the moment it exits the nozzle and the pressure drops, the gel instantly regains its structural integrity.
So it acts as a temporary scaffolding.
Right. Holding the cells in their precise 3D coordinates so they don't just, collapse into a shapeless puddle of goo.
Okay, that makes sense. So the software then acts as the blueprint. A computer takes a 3D model of a tissue structure, slices it horizontally into hundreds of incredibly thin cross-sections.
Yep, standard 3D printing stuff.
Right. And the printhead deposits that bioink one layer at a time to match the digital architecture. But once the printer stops, you don't actually have an organ yet, do you?
No, not at all. You just have a fragile structure of shock cells sitting in a gel matrix. The print itself is really just the beginning.
So what happens next?
The tissue has to cure and mature, which happens inside a device called a bioreactor. You can think of it as an incubator, but it acts way more like a specialized gem for tissue.
The gym.
Yeah. The bioreactor maintains the exact temperature and nutrient flow the cells need, but it also subjects the tissue to physiological conditioning.
By conditioning, you mean like applying the actual physical forces those cells would experience inside a human body.
Exactly. So if you print heart muscle tissue, the bioreactor will apply rhythmic electrical pulses to force those cells to contract and beat in unison.
That is wild.
It really is. And if you print cartilage or bone, the bioreactor applies mechanical compression, literally squishing and stretching the tissue.
Wow. To mimic walking or moving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That physical stress coaxes the cells to mature, to reach out and form extracellular matrices with their neighbors, and to align their fibers correctly.
So the time in the bioreactor is what transforms just a pile of raw cells into a functioning piece of biology?
You got it.
Which brings us to the actual hardware pushing out those cells. Because the sources detail that researchers don't just use one type of printer.
No, because biology is just so diverse, you have to constantly trade off between speed, resolution, and cell viability.
So there isn't just one universal bioprinter that everyone uses.
Nope. The industry relies on a toolkit of different methods depending on the tissue they need to build.
Okay, let's go through the 4 methods.
Sure. So the direct descendant of that hacked Clemson printer is the inkjet method.
Right.
It uses thermal or piezoelectric actuation to just fire tiny droplets of bioink. It's incredibly fast and inexpensive.
But I'm guessing there's a downside.
Yeah, structural integrity. It cannot handle highly viscous gels or densely packed cells, so it's useful for thin, flat tissues, but terrible for dense bulk.
So if you were trying to build a thick, dense organ like a liver, droplets just won't cut it. You need structural stability.
Exactly. And that's where the field pivots to the extrusion method. Instead of firing droplets, it uses a pneumatic or mechanical piston to squeeze the bioink out in a continuous line.
Like a microscopic toothpaste tube.
Yeah, perfect analogy. And extrusion is basically the workhorse of the industry right now. Because you're pushing a continuous line, you can use highly viscous bioinks packed with a massive density of cells.
Which you need for solid organs.
Right. But the trade-off there is resolution. The extruded lines are relatively thick, meaning you lose the ability to print really sharp, microscopic details.
And losing fine detail is a massive problem when you're trying to replicate microscopic biology.
Definitely. Which birthed a completely different approach using light-based printing, like stereolithography.
Okay, how does that work?
Instead of pushing gel through a nozzle, the bioink is just a vat of liquid photopolymer resin. The printer projects a precise pattern of light into the vat, and wherever the light hits, the liquid instantly hardens into a solid hydrogel.
So it's just zapping a liquid into a solid.
Yeah. And light-based printing gives incredible resolution because you're bound only by the pixel size of your light source. You can cure entire layers in a single flash.
Capturing details way finer than a squeezed line of gel ever could.
Exactly. But if you need absolute single-cell precision, researchers turn to the 4th method, laser-assisted printing.
Laser-assisted?
Right. This uses pulses of laser energy to essentially blister a donor slide, and that gently propels individual cells onto a receiving substrate. It causes virtually no damage to the cell membrane.
Wait. If the laser method guarantees the cells survive and offers the highest precision, why isn't it just the standard across the board? Like, why bother with the extrusion toothpaste method at all?
It comes down to the unforgiving math of scale. Yeah. A human liver contains hundreds of billions of cells. If you attempt to place them individually using a laser, the process is so agonizingly slow that the first cells you printed would starve and die of old age long before you finished the rest of the organ.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, so you need speed and bulk on one end of the spectrum and single-cell precision on the other. You have to choose the tool based on the specific anatomical feature you're building.
That makes total sense. And that actually brings us to the central conflict of this entire deep dive.
The wall.
Right. We have the bioink formulations. We have the bioreactors to cure the tissue. We have 4 distinct, highly advanced methods for placing the cells.
Yeah.
So why is the wait list still at 100,000 people? Why aren't we just printing full working human hearts today?
The answer lies in a really strict biological constraint known as the 200 micrometer rule.
The 200 micrometer rule.
Yes. In the human body, Passive diffusion, which is the physical process of oxygen and nutrients drifting through tissue, that only works over very short distances.
How short?
Every single cell in your body must be within roughly 200 micrometers of a capillary. That's about the width of 2 hairs.
Okay, so really close.
Yeah. If a cell is any further away from a blood supply, it cannot pull in enough oxygen, and it can't expel lactic acid and carbon dioxide.
It just suffocates in its own toxic waste and dies.
Exactly.
And this perfectly explains the massive gap between printing thick and thin tissue. Printing a patch of skin for a burn victim or a thin sheet of knee cartilage is achievable because the tissue is thin enough that every cell is close to the surface.
Right, they can just absorb nutrients directly from the surrounding culture media in the lab. Thin tissue is relatively simple.
But real life-saving organs are incredibly thick, dense structures.
Yes, the only reason a thick organ stays alive in your body is because it is threaded with an unbelievably complex three-dimensional branching network of blood vessels.
Scaling all the way down from large arteries to microscopic capillaries.
Capillaries that are actually thinner than a single red blood cell.
Wow. And the analogy in the research that I think perfectly illustrates this mechanism is building a massive state-of-the-art skyscraper, but completely failing to install the elevators, the air conditioning ductwork, and the plumbing.
That's a great way to put it.
You can finish construction, and the exterior looks flawless, but the center of the building is completely uninhabitable because nothing can move in or out.
That is precisely what happens on the lab bench. If you use an extrusion printer to build a thick block of liver tissue, but you fail to integrate a microscopic vascular network inside it, the outer layer of cells touching the nutrient bath will survive.
But the entire core is just isolated.
Yeah. Without vascularization, without that plumbing, the printed organ is essentially a necrotic core wrapped in living tissue. It literally rots from the inside out within hours.
So the printing mechanics aren't even the primary bottleneck anymore, it's the plumbing.
Exactly.
And human hands, or even traditional CAD software, cannot possibly manually weave a network of billions of branching capillaries. We are entirely unequipped to draft a blueprint that complex.
Right. So to solve the vascularization wall, researchers have had to integrate artificial intelligence.
The cavalry arrives.
Yep. Designing a capillary bed that delivers equalized blood pressure to billions of cells is fundamentally a fluid dynamics and computing problem.
Because the vascular tree inside you was shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary trial and error.
Precisely. To design one from scratch, scientists are handing the parameters over to machine learning algorithms. They use generative design, often mimicking L systems or fractal mathematics found in nature.
To calculate those optimal branching supply lines.
Yes, where the math guarantees no single cell falls outside that 200 micrometer survival zone.
But the AI isn't just generating the blueprints, right? It's actively monitoring the manufacturing process.
Oh, totally. Getting a print right means balancing dozens of variables simultaneously. The flow rate of the bioink, the ambient temperature, the cross-linking speed of the gel.
So the machine learning systems monitor the prints in real time.
Yeah, analyzing the extrusion path and tweaking the pressure on the fly to prevent microscopic flaws from forming.
And some of the most advanced labs are even taking that integration a step further into autonomous closed-loop systems.
This is where it gets really sci-fi.
Right. The AI designs a tissue structure, sends it to the printer, the hardware builds it, and then automated sensors measure cell viability.
Yep.
But wait, how do you measure cell viability in a closed loop without just destroying the fresh print to look at it under a microscope?
They use non-destructive testing. This system incorporates sensors directly into the bioreactor culture media to measure oxygen depletion or lactic acid output in real time.
Oh, that makes sense.
They can also use impedance spectroscopy, which is passing tiny electrical currents through the gel to measure cellular resistance.
Okay, so the AI takes that viability data, feeds it back into its own algorithm, adjusts the fractal design of the blood vessels or the density of the bioink, and then just prints a new iteration.
Exactly. It learns from every single attempt, optimizing the architecture around the clock without human intervention.
And we are actually seeing major biotech companies applying these exact mechanisms right now. Like Organovo is a great example.
Oh yeah, Organova's doing great work.
They aren't trying to print full livers for transplant yet. Instead, they're printing what are called organoids.
Right. Organoids are a crucial stepping stone. They are miniaturized 3D clusters of printed organ tissue, basically like tiny functional spheroids of a human liver,
And Organovo has successfully printed liver organoids that survive for over a month.
which is a huge deal. Pharmaceutical companies use these to test the toxicity of new experimental drugs on actual human tissue.
Bypassing animal testing entirely.
Yeah. And identifying dangerous side effects long before clinical trials even start.
Then you have companies directly attacking the plumbing problem we talked about. Prellis Biologics is utilizing a highly advanced form of light-based printing, multiphoton holography, to print microscopic capillaries at incredible speeds.
They're trying to build the vascular scaffolding faster than the surrounding cells can die.
Right. And United Therapeutics is taking a similar manufacturing approach, heavily funding the development of high-resolution 3D scaffolds specifically for lungs.
And we definitely have to mention Anthony Atala's team at the Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine.
Wow, absolutely.
They have been pioneers in clinical applications, running trials on printed skin, ear-shaped cartilage, and assistive tissue patches.
Okay, so let's synthesize all of this into a realistic timeline for the listener, because the hype in biotechnology often outpaces the regulatory and scientific reality.
Very true.
Based on all these sources, what is actually viable right now, what is coming in the next decade, and what is still far over the horizon?
Well, in the present term, like right now, we can reliably print simple avascular tissues. Skin grafts for severe burn victims, small pieces of cartilage, and those organoids used for pharmaceutical testing are all real and actively advancing.
Because they don't require that massive internal plumbing network.
Exactly. They are achievable with current technology.
Okay, so moving into the midterm, say the next 10 to 15 years, the focus shifts to assistive bioprinting.
Yes. We won't be replacing entire solid organs yet, but we will be supporting failing ones. So if a patient suffers a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, and a section of their heart muscle dies.
The goal is to print a living patch of their own cardiac tissue.
Right. Surgeons can apply that patch directly to the damaged area to integrate and repair the heart rather than just waiting around for a full transplant.
Okay, which leaves the far-term goal. Printing a complete, thick, transplant-ready kidney or heart and seamlessly plumbing it into a waiting patient.
And that remains strictly gated by the vascularization problem.
The 200 micrometer rule strikes again.
Yep. We have to be able to manufacture capillaries at massive scale and then navigate the years of rigorous safety testing and FDA approvals that will follow. The roadmap is definitely clear, but anyone promising a printed liver in a hospital next year is completely ignoring the physics of fluid dynamics.
So the single bottleneck has a name, and the entire industry is focused on it.
The DEA lab definitively proves they can quickly and reliably print functioning capillary networks deep inside a thick block of tissue. That is the day the organ waitlist days are officially numbered.
That is the threshold where this transitions from an engineering challenge into standard medical practice.
Absolutely.
So for everyone listening, the first time this technology directly impacts your life, it likely won't be a dramatic, headline-making organ transplant.
No, probably not.
It will be a quietly revolutionary moment. It will be a targeted cancer drug that was rapidly developed because it could be safely tested on thousands of printed organoids.
Or it'll be a biopatch that flawlessly heals a torn meniscus using a hydrogel packed with your own cells.
The science of placing the cells is solved. The war now is entirely about the plumbing.
Yep, it's all about the pipes.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder that builds on the implications of this research. If this roadmap holds true, and bioprinting eventually succeeds in allowing us to seamlessly swap out failing, diseased organs with brand new, biologically identical replacements printed on demand from our own cells.
Yeah.
Do we eventually stop viewing the human body as something that inevitably ages out? Do we begin treating our biology like a classic car? Just a framework that, with the right manufactured parts, can simply be maintained indefinitely.
That is a wild thought.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.